Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Inside Infrastructure. I'm Adrian Dwyer and I'm joined as always by my co-host Ilya Zak from our series sponsor PwC Australia. Ilya, how are you going?
I'm well, Adrian. Happy to be back with another episode after a little break for the election. Although having taken that break, I kind of wish I'd gotten in on some of the last minute betting opportunities. Seems like the bookies were as surprised as the media was with the outcome.
It certainly wasn't the outcome the media were projecting, or the punters, I guess.
It wasn't at all. With that in mind, though, leaving aside the wider tax and welfare-based policy differences, does IPA have any thoughts on what this election outcome means for the infrastructure sector?
So it's interesting. The projects were actually, there was a high degree of consensus between the parties. They were unusually bipartisan. I guess it reflects that the Commonwealth is a funder of projects rather than an initiator of projects. They do what the states have available. The states deliver infrastructure. So for the most part, there actually wasn't that much difference between the parties on a project basis. Some differences at the margins.
Maybe some policy differences?
Policy differences there were. So there was a big push from the Labour Party around electric vehicles and the policy implications of those. They had a target of 50% of sales of a non-mandated target, 50% of sales of electric vehicles by 2030. Set against a coalition that had a different view, a more of a market-led view around that. There was also some differences around energy policy that we're all familiar with. I think that's a challenge that this Parliament has got to deal with. It's one that should be bipartisan. It's one that we need to correct. Is a settled energy policy one that the sector can respond to, and it's something that Kerry Schott spoke about in great length on the podcast we did with her. That we need a good policy, but we need a policy, and it needs to be settled.
Interesting. Well, there's never a slow week in government in Australia, and with that in mind, we've got the Victorian budget coming up later this week. They delayed it, I believe, to avoid the federal election campaign, and we had the good fortune of speaking with the Victorian Treasurer Tim Pallas a few weeks ago, just as it was being finalised. He's a very interesting member of Parliament in Victoria, and so without further ado, here's our chat with Treasurer Tim Pallas.
So Treasurer Tim Pallas, welcome to Inside Infrastructure. We'll begin with, I'm a big Formula One fan, and I'd just like to know why you called five-time world champion and racing legend Lewis Hamilton a dickhead.
Well, that was a strange confluence of events. As Roads Minister, I had on that very day released a online media campaign aimed at young people and a micro directed media campaign through the internet, which was basically "Don't be a dickhead" to young men who were hooning on the roads. Unfortunately for me, I was on radio with 3AW that day promoting it, which happened to be the very same day after Lewis Hamilton had been caught.
So he drove away from the circuit and...
He'd breached our hooning laws by basically losing traction and going at speed to the general merriment of the crowd of young men who were assembled. So on Neil Mitchell that next day, well, you're launching this campaign. Would you use the very same word that you've used in your campaign to describe Lewis Hamilton? I said, look, I don't think we really should get into that, should we? We've got to be nice. This is broadcast media. And he said, no, if you're courageous enough to say it then, why won't you say it now? I said, well, okay, I'll say it. He was a dickhead. And I got very nasty letters from my English relatives, my British relatives, who said I had a potty mouth. And I tried to explain the context to them, but it was all lost on them. But I did make front page news in the UK.
There you go.
That's a claim to fame.
That's an achievement. Yeah,
it must have been coordinated.
An unreconstructed colonial.
So the calling Lewis Hamilton that, obviously a high point in the career, but maybe you could talk to us about how you got there. So how did you get into politics and how did it all start?
Well, sort of accidental in a way. I studied arts law at ANU.
And you're from Newcastle in New South Wales?
I'm from Newcastle originally, and then at the age of 17 and a bit, I moved down to Canberra to study arts law. I had a great interest in public administration, and it was the area that I wanted to get involved in. And I figured that ANU offered a good administrative law and public administration grounding. So I studied there for 5.5, 6 years. At the end of that, I applied for a job with a very small union, the Federal Firefighters Union. I became their sole industrial employee, and they looked after airport firefighters and also the civil brigade in the ACT.
Were you drawn to that because it was a union, or you were just looking for a job?
No, I was drawn to it because of my affection for the union movement,
right.
Largely because of my engagement with unions, largely through holiday jobs.
Okay.
Every 3 or 4 months break you get at the end of the year, you have to drum up a bit of income so that you can help your family support you at university, and that's what I did. So I worked in the meatworks, I worked in the steelworks, and I was very strongly committed to the principles of unionism. So after that, I got the job with the Federal Firefighters Union, stayed there a little while, and then was offered a job with the Storemen and Packers Union, and I worked for them for close to a decade and became their Assistant National Secretary. And shortly after becoming their Assistant National Secretary, maybe a year and a half, I was offered the job of Assistant Secretary of the ACTU. Took that job on. Then Steve Brax.
What year are we talking for the ACTU role?
1995.
Right.
1997 for the ACTU. By 1999, I was offered a job with Steve Brax as his acting Chief of Staff in opposition. I thought it was a strange career move, considering that I thought it was a long shot that Steve would win the 99 election campaign against Jeff Kennett, but he was a good friend. And
Steve also thought he was a long shot, didn't he?
No, he will say to this very day that he was always confident that he was going to be able to get there.
It's an easy one with hindsight, though, isn't it?
Yes. I, for my part, never thought he was a done deal, but it was great working with him. He had great political instincts, but also a generous personality and great values. So I enjoyed working with him. When, of course, we won the 99 election campaign, I was on a secondment from the ACTU, so I had the opportunity to go back, should I wish, and I decided that this was too much fun, sort of working with Steve Brax and a government of young ministers who were learning the ropes. So we learnt the ropes together. It was most of our, in fact, I don't think there was a minister in that government that had been a minister before, so we were basically learning the ropes together.
And you'd be pretty rare in that you went from a chief of staff job straight into being an MP and into cabinet, is that?
That's right, Yep. In fact, I was sworn in as a minister before I'd been declared as the member for Tarneet that I'd run for. And apparently that's all kosher. So I suppose to get to the point of the question, how did I get into politics? Inadvertently. I'd pretty much marked out my career as being a career in the labour movement and the trade union movement in particular.
So industrial relations was the key interest for you and the key draw into politics?
It was, and it remains a great passion of mine. I'm now the Minister for Industrial Relations, and I genuinely believe in cooperative workplace relations, and I believe that representatives of workers can add considerably to the capacity and the performance of companies, provided everybody works in a cooperative way and there's a general recognition that the workforce deserve a fair a day's pay for a fair day's work.
So there's an interesting thing that you mentioned there, which is and it draws on, I think, some of your experience during a very formative period for industrial relations in Australia, negotiating the accord through the Hawke-Keating years. That was in a bit of a liberalisation of industrial relations policy in Australia, but in in effect led by the union movement. That it's a non-traditional kind of bipartisan reform exercise. Can you see something like that happening today?
Look, I hope that we can get back to a period where the idea of tripartism becomes serious. Certainly the idea of government and Labor working closely together, organised labour, I think that is vitally important to the long-term future and prospects of this country in terms of being able to reach our productivity imperative, but also recognising that you sit around the table from a position of mutual respect.
So the Andrews government's actually been quite a reforming government, but it's quite relatively small scale type reforms with the sale of the port, which I think they're very substantial, but they're not like these whole economy wide things. It does feel like reform at a national level hasn't really happened since, well, certainly for the last decade, there's not been a great deal of reform. Is that just where we are on the curve, or?
Well, I do worry a bit about it. I think there is cause for concern in the sense that we can't simply sit back and assume that the next great initiative around reform is going to simply happen. It requires a fair degree of hard work, commitment, and, might I say, a willingness to make hard decisions. I do think, the sort of big reforms that we saw out of the Hawke-Keating government, the big reforms that we saw coming out of the Rudd and Gillard government, particularly around infrastructure and infrastructure planning, all those seem to have been forgotten, and everything seems to be about getting an announcement out that achieves a decent front page.
So it's an interesting point, actually, because we're joking about the Lewis Hamilton thing, obviously, but that's
well, it's the only time you made the papers in the UK.
Exactly, that's the thing. That's the soundbite.
True.
You can discuss policy at length. But if you call Lewis Hamilton something again, that's probably the bit that's going to make it to the papers. Do you think that it's maybe the media environment that makes it that much more challenging?
Oh well, I don't want to criticise the media in the sense that I think that they're in a business and they're in the business of selling papers, and politicians need to understand that they're as much a product as they are in the business of delivering public policy.
Right.
So, yes, I often complain in private moments about what I see as being harsh treatment by the media. What I do think, however, is ultimately we have to be able to sell our message. We have to be able, with a fair degree of courage, to be able to get out there and stand up to the harsh questioning that we might not like, but is a necessary part of a functioning democracy. So for my part, I think it would be better if we could turn the column inches into a much more substantive policy debate or a genuine assessment of how each side of politics is performing. I read recently from a journalist that the job of journalism is to hold governments to account. And I think that's a legitimate way of looking at it. But if you look at it exclusively that way, the practical consequence is all you're doing is focusing all your effort on the government
negatives.
And the negatives, absolutely, and not on how an opposition is performing and how they might perform as an aspiring government. It's about trying to even up the contest.
Yeah.
I would see the job as holding all politicians to account rather than, and balance in reporting should necessarily be not giving equal airtime to a preposterous proposition.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah. The interpretation of balance it's a funny one. It's you've got an absurd argument and a good argument. You give them 50-50, and it's a bit. That's not actually balanced. That's an unbalanced. Can you tell us a bit about Werribee? I don't know it well. So
it's a great community. It's in the local government area of Wyndham, and it's the fastest or one of the fastest growing local government areas in the country.
They all claim that though, don't they?
They do, and they have very animated debates about whether it's in percentage terms or absolute terms. But I think we could safely say with a growth rate of around about 7%.
It's pretty high.
It's growing enormously.
Yep.
And
is that's commuters? people commuting into Melbourne?
So about, there's a lot. About 70% of the workforce in Wyndham commute on the roads to another local government area to go to their workplace. And the population of Wyndham is now bigger than the population of Geelong. So it's big, getting bigger quickly.
How did you land in that electorate?
Well, it was essentially as a consequence of me wanting to run for Parliament. Steve Brack's suggesting that I was a good fit. I wanted to represent the western suburbs of Melbourne. I've lived in the western suburbs of Melbourne all my adult life, and consequently, I certainly didn't see a lot of time or opportunity in the upper house. No criticism of our friends in the upper house, but I wanted to be in the bear pit of politics, which is the lower house of Parliament.
Absolutely.
Before we get into specific policy things, I'm interested by the combination of industrial relations and treasurer. It would seem to me as an outsider that you might want to split those two things up so that you can externalise the potential conflict that exists from different ministerial portfolios. Is my conception wrong? And how do you deal with the internalised conflict if my perception's right?
Well, it's a real problem in the sense that you do have to compartmentalise your responsibilities, but of course added to industrial relations and treasurer is economic development as well. So my job principally is to make sure that the government not only has a good balance sheet, but is budgeting well. That is, we're looking beyond the things that we're dealing with today to deal with the capacity to manage downturns in revenue, to manage opportunities as they present themselves to the government, hence economic development as a portfolio, but also to recognise that our workforce constitute over 40% of our output expenditure in terms of wages. So we need to also have a good relationship with them and to make the right choices about whether we employ, how much more we employ to provide the services of the fastest growing city and state in the nation, but also to ensure that we give the workforce a fair return on their labour as well.
So why Treasury are the best paid bureaucrats?
Well, I wish they were. In fact, I suppose I'm not a bureaucrat, and no, I don't wish you were. I like you working as hard and efficiently as you are at the moment. But I think
that's a tough internal conversation that you have to have with yourself daily, isn't it?
Well, true, and it's part of what being a treasurer is, because particularly a Labor treasurer. I don't see my job as inhibiting the hopes and the expectations, the plans that ministers have. But I also recognise that the hardest thing for Labor governments is to have to say no. And it's not because you want to, but it's because you need to recognise that you've got to back the most important, imperative and, might I say, well-structured proposals and find the funds to ensure that they come to reality. You can't say yes to everything.
So it's something that we wanted to ask you about. You've come from, I guess, the biggest spending portfolio. Mostly, you've through your career, you've been an infrastructure guy, and now you're the one writing the checks,
or the one saying no,
or the one saying no. Which one's more fun?
Oh, look, Treasury is a lot of fun, but building infrastructure, you couldn't pass it up, I think. And I don't say that as a frustrated infrastructure minister. In fact, we've got a great infrastructure minister in Jacinta Allen for transport infrastructure. But I say it because I think, look, people recognise governments for what they do, and that's the trademark of this government. As Treasurer, you're part of the enablement process, providing the wherewithal and making sure that the plans that are being proposed to be prosecuted to deliver infrastructure are done as efficiently, cost efficiently, but also efficiently in time as is possible. So it's not my job to second guess infrastructure ministers in what they do, but I do on occasion look with a twinge of jealousy at the great job that they're doing, and to recognise that as a government, you're counted for what you do on infrastructure, how you build it, how you deliver it, and what you choose is a vital part of that mix as well. So I think as a government, the planning that we put into this, the assessment of what is important and when should it be built is a critical part of good governance, and finding the capacity to do it, making sure that you're prepared to look at a range of funding options in order to ensure not only that you can deliver it efficiently, but that you've got a good relationship with the private sector so you can leverage greater effort.
So talking of the capacities, you've got a budget coming up at the very end of this month, first one of this new term, this new parliament. I guess it's this will be your fifth.
This will be my fifth budget.
Yes. Most of the preceding four have been in a period of sort of growth in the housing market. There's been relatively strong revenue flows. This one may be in a slightly more challenging environment, more global and domestic headwinds. Challenges in that to find the capacity to keep funding the infrastructure for growth?
Oh yeah, I think it's we can't overdo this, but I think without sugarcoating it, I've said to the community that this will be a budget of hard choices. The one thing that people can be assured about is that this government will deliver on its election commitments. And on top of that, we need to recognise that good governments are defined by how they manage adversity and the hard times, not necessarily by how they dole out the benefit of providence. And I think this government has done well to pick up a state that was not performing particularly well. I think we were the fifth rated state in terms of economic performance by ComSec when we came to government. We've lifted it now to the first, equal first apparently with New South Wales this quarter, but for the 2 quarters preceding that, the first and best performing state in the nation. And we've done it in a sense that we've substantially improved the performance, the economic performance of the state. Our GDP growing at 3.5%, the nation growing at 2.6%.
You're in a difficult position as a state treasurer because you have all the responsibility for delivering infrastructure, but you don't really have any substantial taxing powers. The taxes that you have are
set in stone, more or less. They're
main volatile, and there's not a lot you can do on the
GST and
the upside of the budget. What do you think of that? That puts you in a hard place.
Oh, well, I think that if I'd have had an opportunity to recast the way that the Federation operates, particularly how the Constitution is interpreted by the High Court, I would say that you probably should put the taxing responsibilities with those who are charged with responsibility for delivering the service, the classic horizontal fiscal equalisation problem. But the truth is, it is what it is, and there's no point complaining about it. You just got to get on and do what you can.
Well, yes. So in this period now, particularly with the federal election coming up, there's going to be a lot of, from both sides, there'll be a lot of announcements. I mean, we've already seen some of them particularly supporting Victorian infrastructure. And in the past, you've lamented the lack of announcements in Victoria as well.
They got to keep them coming, would be my advice, Adrian. I mean,
how do you get their support though?
For infrastructure?
Yeah. How do you decide on which projects you'd like support for? How do you decide how much you want them to put in?
Well, it's an exercise in advocacy as much as anything else. Firstly, the government that's required to deliver the infrastructure, which is the state government, has to get on and identify where their priorities lie. Then we have to be able to lobby the Commonwealth in a way that's effective, sometimes by demonstrating that we're bringing cash to the table as well in a partnership to deliver these projects. By all means, an assessment by infrastructure body like Infrastructure Australia, Infrastructure Victoria helps the case, but doing your preparation around how we rate these pieces of infrastructure and how we prioritise them in the context of what we accept is a finite pool of funds. But from our perspective, Victoria's done pretty poorly in terms of allocations out of the Commonwealth. We got down as low, I think, as about 7% of national infrastructure funding. I think over the next, and by the way, the state is now on about 17.7% of national infrastructure funding, still a long way short of the 26% of our population share. And really what that tells us is we've got to this strange situation where everybody fixates about the Commonwealth government, but they're not driving this bus when it comes to infrastructure.
That's the funny thing, though, that, in some instances they'll contribute 50%, in some instances 20%. And we had Anthony Albanese on a couple of episodes ago, and his suggestion was that you should start with 50-50, and it's as good a suggestion as any, but it's difficult to see how, through that negotiation process, how you settle on whatever the final number is.
Well, the days are gone, of course. I'm old enough to remember roads of national importance,
right,
where the Commonwealth were funding 90% of some country roads. And even Anthony Albanese, a classic illustration and a great infrastructure minister in the Rudd-Gillard government, they put in the lion's share of the contribution towards regional rail link, a vitally important project that if that investment hadn't been made, the state of Victoria would not have been able to deliver it. By contrast, the state Victorian government is delivering, $13.6 billion worth of infrastructure this year alone, and will deliver $10.6 billion of infrastructure each and every year going forward. We're delivering it by getting on and doing the work and cutting the ribbons and delivering the infrastructure so we can grow our economy, grow jobs. Over 450,000 jobs created in this state in the 4 years that we've been in government.
One of the things that's underpinned that, of course, has been the sale of the port, the sale of the long-term leasing of the port, the long-term leasing of the land titles services. Strikes me that political persuasions aside, the New South Wales Liberal government and the Victorian Labor government have played broadly from the same playbook there on, releasing capital from legacy assets and investing it in new infrastructure. Does that mean you've got more in common with a New South Wales state treasurer than you've got with a Commonwealth treasurer of any persuasion?
Well, we have many things in common. I mean, state governments are about service delivery and delivering infrastructure, but our values are very, very different, as you'd appreciate. But it all comes down to the balance sheet at the end of the day, because if you can't provide those great ministers in your government, and we've got plenty of them in the Andrews government, if you can't provide them with the wherewithal to go on and deliver the policy agenda of the government, the social agenda of the government, but more importantly, the services that the community expects of us, then if the balance sheet doesn't work, then the government doesn't work for the people, in my view. And
can I just drill into that a little bit? The balance, as a treasurer, you probably would have noticed that governing is a hell of a lot easier when there's unlimited money coming in. When the budget is booming, decisions are easier to make. In New South Wales and Victoria's case, in particular, stamp duty is coming off right now quite substantially with the reduction in real estate transactions. How's that going to affect the Victorian budget? Can you see any reforms coming out of that? Is there an opportunity in that to go ahead with some reforms to stamp duty? And you probably know what I'm hinting at.
Oh, well, I mean, yes, we are seeing a downturn in stamp duty receipts, and that's due to a downturn both in terms of price, about just short of 10% below the high of November 2017.
But when I bought my house,
when you bought your house,
in November 2017,
yes, strategic investing. I think I've suffered the same fate in the past, so I feel your pain.
Yeah.
But we're also seeing that there is a very significant downturn in volume, and that probably hurts more.
Yeah.
I think REIV estimated at about 35% downturn in volume.
And that kind of volatility makes managing the budget substantially more difficult, doesn't it?
Well, it does, and we've already announced one write-off in the mid-year budget update, and I've been clear that there are more to come in the budget itself. So there are a couple of points that I would make by way of consolation to people. Firstly, we've planned for this. We didn't simply hope to wander into a flood of funds forever. And we've been putting those funds to work, and we've also been putting ourselves in a strong economic position. For people who own property and they're seeing their property prices drop down, can I console you by saying that in the last 6 years, if you owned a property in metropolitan Melbourne, your property will have increased by about 50%. Now, yes, there will be some correction in the market, and it's happening now. But I think in the long term, people will be well served by the properties that they own.
This cyclical volatility in stamp duty, it just makes your job and every treasurer, state treasurer's job, besides the ACT, perennially difficult because you're trying to second guess the cycles of the market with how
How's the ACT?
Well, they've moved over 20 years. They're moving to land tax.
Yep, in 20 years' time.
So a treasurer in 20 years' time
Yep.
in the ACT will be presented with a much more stable.
Yes.
Is there an opportunity
Mind you,
to do reform?
They don't have the capacity to raise payroll tax against their biggest employer.
And also they're a state government and a local council in effect. So there's some
So
advantages
raise
there.
rates.
They're a unique situation, but I guess it's we're not treading new ground here. The debate about stamp duty and land tax is pretty well worn. It's in the Henry Review. Stamp duty, very inefficient tax. Land tax is usually proposed as the recommended alternative or the replacement for it. Can you see any pathway to that in the larger states in Australia, including Victoria, obviously?
First thing I'd say is every government needs to make sure that they've got sufficient capacity within their budgets to do the things that they're doing at the moment and the things they plan to do. And we've gone to great efforts through our what I call our fiscal parameters, the road rules of how we manage our budget, not to spend more than we earn, and to demonstrate that over the economic cycle. Secondly, keep debt below the level we inherited for anything other than intergenerational investment. And thirdly, to make sure that we deliver consistently surpluses. Now, what does that mean in terms of the need for reform? I think we all have to accept that as governments, we need to look at ways that we can reform the system. But the idea that you basically move towards a across-the-board tax on the private home, which is what is being assumed here, I think is something that every politician will tread warily on, because people will be very concerned about what that means, and they would need to be well and truly assured that that would be offset by other taxes that they would otherwise have to pay.
Aren't they already paying that tax, but in a big upfront chunk when they buy the home?
Yeah, well, it's an argument, but it's an argument that I think economists will say from all rational points of view should be self-evident. But for people who manage budgets week to week, it's a much more compelling concern that they're confronted with the idea that they actually have to pay a tax that didn't exist before. Once every 7 years, and you make a choice when you sell, you take into account the cost of stamp duty. But every year you'll know under that sort of regime that you have to pay land tax. And I think the population would need to be well and truly convinced, as would I, that moving to that in an immediate and across-the-board sense is a good thing. I don't think it is. I think it would be against the interests of people who are already struggling to make ends meet. We've got particularly low levels of wage adjustment right across the nation. And I think if we move into a state where the only reform, the answer to anything, and you ask most economists, how do we get good microeconomic reform going in this country? Or they say, flip stamp duty into land tax.
It's often the first response.
That's it. I mean, we've got to look beyond our tax base and look more towards, well, how do we actually get a greater and more productive community? And importantly, that means the choices of infrastructure, delivering infrastructure efficiently, better engagement with the private sector around that infrastructure delivery.
Making sure it's used efficiently.
And, going back to those old reforms, the reforms where the Commonwealth and the states worked well together. Let's not forget that it was the Victorian government that came up with the idea of case mix management, and our health systems are functioning so much better for it. Or it was the Victorian government working together cooperatively with a coalition federal government, the Howard government, that came up with the replacement for the productivity proposals. So the reform agenda, the national reform agenda. It slipped my mind for a moment. We have to find how governments at all tiers can work cooperatively. This idea that one tier should do it better than another, I think is it's foolhardy because it distracts us from the important things that we have to do.
There's a very interesting example of that, of the two levels of government working together, led by Victoria, which was during the national competition policy, which was embraced here more than anywhere else in Australia. You're operating under some of the results of that, of those reforms, and the one that I'm particularly interested in, because it's very unique here, is the franchised trains
and trams.
And trams, of course. Although they're, I believe, in New South Wales, they'll be franchised as well.
It's a much more extensive network.
So slightly more extensive network here.
Well, they're two trams.
I'm not gonna
There's not one on George Street. It's only one tram.
I'll just make the point that we have the largest tram network by meterage in the world.
That's right.
And probably the most sophisticated franchises anywhere in the world are certainly comparable to what's happened in the UK.
How do you find that, managing that from a government perspective? This service that, I mean, rail it's had some difficulties in the UK, the franchising, because I think it's blamed on the separation of rolling stock from the track. But here it seems to be it's not even a discussion anymore. Bringing it back into government, it seems to be working quite well. How do you find it?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's a done deal every time the franchise comes up. Can I make the point that we expect pretty clear contractual arrangements with our concessionaires? We expect them to meet performance targets, and in the event that they fail to meet performance targets, we expect them to pay a penalty for doing that. But importantly, we have to recognise that we have a responsibility to assist in the provision of the service, which means making sure that sufficient rolling stock is provided to the network so that they can operate effectively. And every concessionaire should recognise that they're not a done deal for an extension on their concession. We will do a public sector comparator against what they're offering.
There's always the threat of taking it away.
Yeah, and it's a real threat in the sense that if we don't get consistently improving performance, then we're doing the wrong thing by the taxpayer by not looking at a public sector provided alternative. Doesn't mean that we're issuing that as a threat. It's just the normal standard operating procedure of this government. We expect to get value out of the contracts that we strike with the private sector. And if we don't get that value, then we will insist upon a comparison against a public sector provided alternative. The state will run that public sector alternative. It's about making sure that there's real competition and real value being delivered. And might I say also innovation from the concessionaire. And I've got to say, we consistently see that we're getting improvements in the way that the service is being provided.
Absolutely.
Under the recent renegotiation of concession arrangements, we've seen improvements in terms of the way that our metropolitan rail network and tram network is operating, and we expect to see that continue.
So where you've been able to align the public good outcome with the profit incentive of the concessionaire, you think that drives good outcomes for
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we all basically react to both positive and negative stimulus, and I think the ultimate defining assessment of this is not against a perfect world, but whether or not we're seeing a clear and demonstrated progress on the delivery of the service.
It's one of Obama's most famous lines, better is good.
Yeah, better is good. Absolutely. The idea is, no government should fall for the trap of making the good or making the perfect the enemy of the good.
We don't have a great deal of time left. I've got a couple of final questions. Just in the last few weeks, in the lead up to the federal budget, federal election campaign, out of nowhere, electric vehicles are suddenly a sort of issue of choice at the national level now. And the discussion appears to be around whether we're going to take away people's choice to drive a particular type of vehicle and whether or not they're all going to be electric. But to me,
and the potential benefits to the environment, those are the two focuses really.
But there's a whole host of policy questions that flow out of it, not least of which is $16 billion worth of Commonwealth fuel excise, some of which through lots of layers ultimately flows to the states in infrastructure funding through
How much do you think,
revenue.
Adrian, we get out of that $16 billion?
I say it was 7% at the lowest point, but
It's more than zero, but it's no. We take your point. It's not enough.
Yeah. Well, don't get me on to grieving about, once again, the High Court knocking off our excise powers and the Commonwealth stepping in and saying, well, thank you, we'll take that and we'll return it to the states, don't you worry. And we get a paltry return on that, but ultimately that's an excise paid for the purposes of improving the quality of the road and transport network.
Scott Charlton on one of our first episodes made the point that the hypothecation discussion has just completely disappeared, and it's a very important discussion to have, clearly.
And now it's, of course, a revenue base that is starting to erode because of fuel efficiency, firstly, and secondly, because the movement towards hybrid and electric vehicles. So I'd be pretty clear in saying, as a state, we think that fuel excise should be managed and in a way that returns it to the states in the way that it was intended to be returned.
So what about when there's nothing left to return? When everyone's driving a Tesla, what do we do?
Well, if everybody's driving a Tesla, we're in a much better world, I've got to say. Any
Elon
other
Musk is in a much better world too.
This is not a paid advertisement. But the state government has a very clear target of through our Victorian renewable energies target. We expect by 2050 we'll get to 50% reduction in emissions, and certainly from our perspective, we're taking very tangible steps to get there.
I mean in the sense of, what do we do about the funding task, which disappears once the
electric... You're worried about the money, not the planet, right? Okay.
Oh, well, we're worried about both, but that's the part that's in the electric car discussion. I think what Adrian was alluding to is the environmental benefits are obviously very important and choice is very important, but there is a consequence to having electric cars, and that is that suddenly a revenue base that is ostensibly meant for roads, whether it's used for that is another discussion, but it's going to disappear. So what do we do about it?
Well, as a non-beneficiary of fuel excise for pretty much, its inception, once it was taken over by the Commonwealth, I mean, the state of Victoria picks up a share, but a pretty paltry share of those allocations. It's probably not so much my problem as it is the Commonwealth's problem to try and fix. We'd be interested in a discussion about how we could ultimately come up with an appropriate way of costing your use of your transport network There's no doubt about that, but not to the extent of simply fitting people up with another tax.
Right.
I'd like to think that if the Commonwealth were looking to move into this area, the first thing they'd demonstrate is how they would be removing fuel excise at the same time as they were looking at alternatives around usage. And quite frankly, there are few coherent strategies around usage that I would feel confident with. For example, a London-style cordon system of charging for road usage only disadvantages the transport poor, people who have got to travel a long time from the outer suburbs.
In New York just now, the de Blasio government there has introduced a similar congestion charge, which, strangely enough, with the support of businesses, Uber and Amazon were apparently very supportive, but on the condition that I think the revenue is hypothecated into public transport. Would that be something that would be more palatable here?
Look, I think the first thing is we are up for a discussion around how we can sensibly manage the use of our road network so that costs are effectively borne where they should most appropriately be borne in terms of usage of the network. But we need to recognise that simply cannot be a charge upon consumers in circumstances where there is no alternative. If people are still using fuel and they're still being charged fuel excise, if those who are travelling longer distances because of their material circumstances are being charged disproportionately simply because they live in the outer suburbs, simply because, well, by and large, they tend to earn less in terms of income. The worst thing to do would be to hit the transport poor and make them even poorer.
So, in principle, it's the right way to go, but there needs to be a substantial discussion, is what you're saying, about how to protect the vulnerable.
We've consistently said as a government this is not part of our plans, but we are prepared to participate in a national debate, provided, of course, we're not simply finding a replacement tax for the Commonwealth.
Right.
And I'd make this point. The only reason the Commonwealth collects fuel excise is because the High Court said the states couldn't do it.
Right.
Any alternative to fuel excise, given that it will be transported on state-owned roads overwhelmingly, should be divided between the states. And quite frankly, given the way that the GST operates, I will be unlikely to sign up to a process where the Commonwealth collects that money and divides it out. It'll have to be divided on very transparent grounds. So we have a very long way to go, and there are a lot of issues that I think in terms of anybody who's genuinely concerned about the welfare of the taxpayer, rather than simply the joy of collecting more tax, would put front of mind.
Final question from me. We mentioned earlier you're sort of an infrastructure minister by background. You have a very important role in infrastructure as Treasurer and a much broader role, and you're on an infrastructure podcast. So what's your favourite sort of infrastructure and why?
Oh, look, I know this is not going to be popular. Well, it might be popular with you, Adrian, but my favourite form of infrastructure is transport infrastructure, and in particular, people won't believe this, but public transport, because I used to be a roads minister. The reason public transport is so important, it provides accessibility to economic opportunity for people who can't necessarily afford to travel to work over long distances. The fact that we've been moving to higher and higher levels of investment towards public transport, such that it is now a much bigger recipient of state government effort than it has achieved in the past, is really a demonstration that we've stepped up to the mark and said this is an important area that we have to give priority to, not only in terms of its economic equalisation opportunity, but because, quite frankly, in a growing economy with a growing population, the fastest growing city in the nation. We need to find ways of moving people and goods to where they need to be as quickly and efficiently as we can. And
do they let you cut the ribbon on any of them as Treasurer?
No, but I had my fair share, and I think it's only fair that I now step back to the younger and more eager generation in this government.
Maybe you can photobomb one of them if they're in Werribee.
I have been known to do that from time to time, living the dream or living their dream.
Treasurer Pallas, thank you very much for your time today. We've also found out that you're a public transport enthusiast, so
don't tell anybody about that. I've kept that a secret for a long time.
Thank you very much, and thanks for your insights today.
Good on you.
Thanks, Treasurer.
So that was Treasurer Tim Pallas. Ilya, what do you think?
Thought it was a good discussion. He certainly stayed on message, as politicians have to do, but I think it was also clear that he came up during a very pragmatic period of unionism in Australia, trade unionism, during the Hawke and Keating era. And it also shows in Victoria's policy positions. They have a lot of privatised infrastructure running in parallel with a very substantial public investment program.
It'd be interesting over the next few weeks to see the impact of the Commonwealth election on Victoria's infrastructure program, because we've seen some projects announced. East West is the most notable one for me, where the Commonwealth government have said they'll put $4 billion into that project, but it's not considered to be a project by the state. It'd be interesting to see how that flows through into the way the Victorians shape their infrastructure program over the coming months.
No doubt you'll be updating that in your infrastructure pipeline.
Yeah, infrastructurepipeline.org. Thanks for the plug.
Anytime. Well, that's it for today. For our listeners, we hope you'll share this podcast with colleagues and anyone you think may be interested, and leave us your reviews and feedback on iTunes or Spotify. We do have a few episodes, including this one, lined up for release that we're sure will be of great interest, so please make sure to subscribe as well. For now, thank you, Treasurer Tim Pallas, for being a guest on the show, and Adrian, as always, for hosting with me.
Thanks, Ilya. Inside Infrastructure is an Infrastructure Partnerships Australia podcast sponsored by PwC Australia, hosted by Adrian Dwyer and Ilya Zak. The show is produced by TAG, PwC Australia's media agency. This episode was produced by Adam Stevens, with research for the episode done by Yosra Alawadi, Linda Bergerson and Mitch Dudley. You can subscribe to future episodes of the show on iTunes, Spotify, Google or wherever you get your podcasts.